Hello, dear friends. Uh, I would like to talk with you on the previous stream on the Hierarchs and Hierarchs in Russia and abroad, because two very main actors in the modern political life and in international security, and these two players, these two actors, are mm, completely forgotten in discussions in Russia, at least. So I would like to draw your attention to their very important role in the talks on Ukraine with its peace pact on lithium and many other raw earth materials. So let's start.
Part 2. In the first part, the political genetics of relations between oligarchs and the military and outside the Russian Federation is mentioned. And today, in the second part, I consider the role of hierarchs, influential authorities for the today's military in the United States and Iran, and probably tomorrow it will deal with the military and the population of the Russian Federation. Recently, Trump has decided to reject occupation of Venezuela because of high expenses for modernization of her gas and oil industry in the nearest future. That is why Iran has appeared to be Trump's better partner in the world of energy business with much better equipment in the Trump's global strategy. Drill, baby, drill. Putin's gas and oil oligarchs turned out to be suckers. So, on what hierarchical groups could the Kremlin rely on today and tomorrow? When will some new, spiritually influential hierarchs replace or weaken the former oligarchs in the Russian Federation? So far, there is no one on the political military horizon but the Russian Orthodox Church and ethnically homogeneous supporters of the so-called Russian world. But can they be attributed to the new hierarchs in the Russian Federation? Your answers to this stream will help to monitor waves of loyalty to the Kremlin. Putin weakened the influence of the former traditional oligarchs of the 1990s with their buy and sell principles, making them weaklings in the political sense. In fact, they lost their autonomy and became dependent on the Kremlin, and many emigrated or lost their assets. Instead, his power, as I argue in opposition to Russian imperialist analysts, rests on hierarchical groups. I mean regional organized crime groups outside the constitution of the Russian Federation. They are not the notorious vertical of power according to the constitution of the Russian Federation of 1993. It was supplemented with an absolutely anti-American, July 4th, 2020 edition on U.S. Independence Day. And now, according to the law and the Constitution, people from the special services and law enforcement agencies are on the top of the political power sector and partly controlling brass caps for the military. They have become the core of the bureaucratic elite with its former elements of nepotism for embezzlement from the federal treasury. This semi-legal semi-oligarchy ensures the control of the collective Kremlin from different regions over the economy, security and ideology of the Russian Federation. U.S. experts on Russia insist on a supercharged protection racket in which the Kremlin, security services, and criminal networks intertwine, expands Moscow's reach and coercive capacity, covered in deniability. Former CIA Chief of Station Gregory Sims warns in the Cipher brief that this blending of criminality and governance not only corrodes Russian institutions but also creates profound blind spots for Western policymakers, whose own legal boundaries leave them ill-equipped to counter an adversary that has collapsed the lines between statecraft and crime. Thus, that semi-oligarchy is still replacing the chaotic influence of the former oligarchs on the centralized loyalty of the regions to the Kremlin, collective Putin. Moreover, by 2026, this system had strengthened against the backdrop of the allegedly endless war in Ukraine. Now it stands for sabotage activity against the oligarchy of the Russian Federation and the CIS in the expectation of $90 billion. From the EU NATO state bureaucracy. We have been witnessing the future of this strategy of the collective West against the collective Putin in Iran since January 2026. In particular, few people know, except for Orientalists, that the Shiite hierarchs overthrew the Persian oligarchs around Shah Pahlavi in 1979. For 45 years, the Shiite hierarchs have turned into a counterproductive oligarchy. And now, under the pressure of its own compatriots, the Persians, around the now secular hierarch Pahlavi II with the support of the hierarch, albeit a Christian one, Trump 47. And Trump stands for business cooperation with Iranian secular hierarchs. Let's return to Russia. Are there any hierarchical groups, apart from the recently overthrown military oligarchs, because they have been constantly under arrest since the spring of 2025, for that Kremlin with or without Putin to rely on? In 2025, 155 high-ranking government officials were arrested for huge embezzlements. And on December 17, 2025, there was an attempt on the life of Defense Minister Belousov. And immediately 12 generals with financial sluices for the war with Ukraine and NATO were arrested for hundreds of billions of rubles. Belousov is an enemy for the military oligarchs and they stood up against him. Every third ruble for defense went into the pockets of the military oligarchy. The estimate for the construction of military facilities is overestimated by 3-4 times. A Chinese bulletproof vest for 1,000 rubles was, according to the documents, as a domestic know-how for 7,000 rubles. A walkie-talkie for 7,000 rubles is issued as a unique communications center for 21,000 rubles. The military oligarchy transfers the difference to offshores and to the safes of cottage settlements in the Moscow region to the relatives of the generals. Siloviki, above the armed forces as the main pillar of the Kremlin, this is a key hierarchical group. Former and current employees of the FSB, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the National Guard and other bodies. They make up more than 20% of senior officials and control key posts. For example, Igor Sechin in Rosneft, Nikolai Patrushev in the Security Council. The collective Putin, as he allegedly comes from the KGB FSB himself, sees in them a guarantee of stability. They suppress the opposition, govern the regions and ensure economic control through deprivatization. The National Guard, over 340,000 people, has become a personal army for internal threats, with large bonuses in 2025, up to 252,000 rubles per person, which emphasizes their priority. What kind of meritocracy is here, where professionalism and talents rule have to be respected? The military and the militarized elite of the oligarchy, which is easily turned into a crime by the Kremlin, as shown by the arrests of almost all of Sergei Shoigu's deputy defense ministers in the spring 2025 and recent arrests in December-January 2026. Therefore, the statement of Grok ChatGPT-4, etc. insists that in 2026 Putin will increasingly rely on the military. Disappointed in the economic bloc of the government is incorrect. In particular, this is reliance on the General Staff, the Ministry of Defense under the leadership of Andrei Belousov from 2024, and on veterans of the special military operation in Ukraine. They say that they will form his new support in the form of a military political hierarchy, allegedly not rich, but honest. I emphasize that the hierarchs are again gaining the upper hand over the oligarchs in order to enlist the support of the population in integrating the new military hierarchs into the elite in the hope of its growth into a greedy oligarchy. Military plans for 2026 imply the strengthening of this group for external and internal tasks, with a focus on patriotism as an ideology. The armed forces and the SOF, Special Operations Forces, are now authorities in law in the protection of sovereignty in the Russian media internet network. Bureaucratic and clan family elite. These are fathers and grandfathers. Officials with family ties, where entire families and clans, and not the people, as the master rule from Moscow to the very outskirts. Studies show that more than half of senior officials have attached relatives, which creates a stable hierarchy of loyalty. The radio station Deutsche Welle estimates it for the sake of receiving goodies from the fuel and energy complex of the Russian Federation by 76%. Yes, formally Putin relies on them for administrative control, including governors and technocrats in the economy. But not so easy and fast. After all, it is the old and vile old-school oligarchs who are replaced by new hierarchs in the armed forces and society. And in response to Andrei Belousov's orders to arrest crooks in military uniform, on the other side of the defenders, the arguments of Professor Solovey are cited that the Tsar is not real. They say, Putin died in November 2024 inches, and therefore it is his doubles who rule the armed forces in society, including in negotiations with Trump 47 on Ukraine. They say that Putin, like Biden, are not real and look like the present-day hierarchs of Iran with their right from some wandering prophet among the Shiites of Iran to rule the military since 1979. I guess that the replacement of oligarchs with hierarchs will be ended with recent events not only in Iran, but also in the United States, where President Biden's signatures seem to be fake, as well as the entire political elite of the Dems and R.I.O.N.O.S on Capitol Hill. That is why on January 3rd, the military, without ceremony and coordination with the U.S. Senate, which is full of revanchist demos, arrested Maduro in Caracas, who was declared an NARCO terrorist by Trump for trial in New York on March 17th. Unless before that it does not occur to the Kremlin to exchange Maduro and his wife for any signature from the Kremlin on a peace pact with Kiev, with Zelensky or the Verkhovna Rada before January 20th to celebrate the anniversary of Trump 47 in power. It could happen on the January 19th at the Davos Economic Forum. So far, the example of the replacement of the old hierarchical complex of U.S. diplomats and lawyers under the U.S. Dems since the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt with new hierarchs from the U.S. power bloc seems logical to me. Trump's hierarchs and oligarchs are about to squeeze the military hierarchs of the Russian Federation into Ukraine by January 20th. For the latter, the ground is burning under their feet due to human and material losses during the shelling of the territory of Ukraine near Poland and south of Odessa by Russian missiles on January 8-9. After all, wait for an answer to this from the entire Jewish Cossacks world community. It is a powerful hierarchical force. It controls TNCs and national businesses loyal to them in the Russian Federation and Ukraine. State corporations and loyal business of the Russian Federation. This is a set of old oligarchs from the head of Gazprom, Alexei Miller, Rosneft and others controlled by the Kremlin. They provide financial flows without alleged political independence. Business asks for predictability, in particular, on the ruble exchange rate, since the business of the fuel and energy complex and the military-industrial complex remains subordinate to the military hierarchs, and not to the digitized oligarchs of the central bank, Sberbank and other digitized banks and exchanges of the Russian Federation. Moreover, that old hierarchical system of petrocracy works through nepotism and the ideological paradigm from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself, service, labor, patriotism, where the hierarchs are those who ensure oppression and stability, but they do not create surplus value within the country, taking money abroad or spending everything on perfume cologne for mistresses and lovers. When and how did the new hierarchs weaken the former oligarchs? The replacement took place in stages in 2000-2004, i.e. during Putin's first term. Key points according to Grok. 2000-2001. Putin introduced the same alleged distance of the oligarchs from power, restoring the state hierarchy and limiting the influence of the semi-bankers from the 1990s on the media and politics while expelling Gusinsky and Berezovsky from the Russian Federation. 2003-2004, The peak of what is called lowering the oligarchy below the plinth began with the arrest of Khodorkovsky, 2003. AI believes that this broke the old oligarchy and the Siloviki and new elites from St. Petersburg, the regions, and especially the special services located there took places in the state apparatus, militarizing the system of public administration in a peculiar way. This transition of power from the oligarchic chaos of the 1990s to the Chekist vertical of power has intensified and deepened since 2026 due to the special military operation and sanctions from the global north. The role of military hierarchs Siloviki has increased, and the old oligarchs have either integrated, like Abramovich, or in the media and the networks have fallen below the plinth in the perception of the armed forces in society, leaving the Russian Federation. But then who, apart from the Russian Orthodox Church and supporters of the Russian world, can be attributed to the new hierarchs? In addition to the Russian Orthodox Church, which is integrated into the system, with Patriarch Kirill as the indisputable ideological authority and the ideologists of the Russian world, anti-Semitic propagandists like Alexander Dugin, the fake TV Jew Vladimir Solovyov, and the talented writer Alexander Prokhanov with his latest anti-Semitic novel, Lemur, about Prigozhin's military revolt allegedly against Putin, etc. The new power hierarchs are Silovyarchs, and not Silovigarchy, as it put in Grok, ChatGPT-4, etc. and special services clans. These are clearly non-public, but influential figures in the armed forces and society could be named as hierarchs like Sechin, Petrushev, Zolotov, Rosgvardia. They combine power in business, forming even a so-called fish mafia or other criminal clans. Technocrats and bureaucrats with nepotism. Fathers and grandfathers are families of officials, where 76%, not 20-50% of civil servants are related to hierarchs in the Kremlin, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the regions. Veterans and militarists from battlefields in Ukraine and other hotspots have been disinteresting previous hierarchs. They are demobilized or disabled if the special military operation quickly integrated into the upper echelons of state administration, governors, deputies, as military hierarchs, and not aristocracy, as AI believes. State capitalists, heads of state corporations, Miller, Sechin, who control resources without an alleged political interest as independent business executives such as the 1920-1929 NEP in the USSR. Regional elites, governors and local clans loyal to the Kremlin, especially its Club of St. Petersburg's Friends. These and a dozen or two other groups form a closed system where loyalty to any of Putin's doubles. Well, as many analysts inside and outside the Russian Federation argue, this personal loyalty to Putin is the only key to your influence on the masses. Any personal wealth for the independence of your business, state, or even empire, like Michael Khodorkovsky was eager to create before his arrest, means nothing under Putin's image of power. Hayek with his open society goes to hell. What is the vulnerability of Putin's power block of hierarchs in the normalization of relations with hierarch Trump 47? Trump has an open bet on peace dividends in resolving disputes and conflicts, even with their soft colonization of Venezuela, in order to prevent the malice of the PRC from seizing all of Latin America, as they did with Canada, where they stole a lot of secrets for IT/AI production for China's breakthrough in global digitalization. And the collective Putin has a lot of public militaristic rhetoric through ex-President Medvedev, in addition to the missile strikes on Ukraine up to now in January. Is this the last peace warning of the Kremlin, like the Chinese did when they captured Damansky Island? Either these are preventive, intimidating, almost nuclear strikes on Europe after simulating hybrid wars against the Baltic states. Or is this an offensive through the structures of the SCOBRICS in the global south? Do you remember the core of General Yevkurov in Africa? The Kremlin needs such a liberation from the United States to feed its power resource counterparties and agricultural exports under the control of the Patrushev family clan, with its Chekists and Cossacks as a massive background. Trump seeks and finds economic mutual benefits from de-escalating tensions in wars and conflicts, as he has changed his business priorities with Venezuela in favor of Iran. With a de-escalation of tensions in Ukraine according to Viktor Orban's plan, the United States will be able to conclude an agreement with Russia without the EU by January 20th, 2026, and then the security forces, both oligarchs and hierarchs, risk losing 90 billion euros for Zelensky's war, for the sake of peace between Ukraine and Europe with the Russian Federation in the nearest future. The supposedly non-mercantile and spiritual hierarchs of the so-called Russian world oppose the same selfless militarist hierarchs led by ex-President Dmitry Medvedev and Sergei Karaganov, ex-chairman of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Both ex are crazy about fantastic nuclear missile destruction of all enemies of Russia. The ideological and rhetorical vulnerability of the military hierarchs of the Russian Federation, they position themselves, like Trump in the armed forces, by the way, as the army of Christians. And these Christian motives are very important to understand and use. I realized this when I met the Christians of the Pentagon and befriended with former U.S. National Security Advisor Robert McFaul in the 1990s. But today, Putin's public militaristic rhetoric, often voiced through Dmitry Medvedev, ex-president and deputy chairman of the Security Council, is based on threats of nuclear strikes on the West and the escalation of hybrid wars. In 2025-2026, Medvedev repeatedly warned of a nuclear apocalypse in the event of NATO intervention, and also promoted hybrid operations in the global south as a response to the colonialism of the West military hierarchs of the Russian Federation. On the other hand, Trump the hierarch, by emphasizing the clearly fake Putin's readiness for peace and focusing on economic dividends, for example, through the easing of sanctions to reduce energy prices in and out of the United States, undermines the Kremlin's nuclear missile Trojan horse move of the mid-20th century. But how? First, Trump instantly on January 3rd blocked the oil flow to Venezuela and Iran with his special operation to reduce finance for the SMO in Ukraine. And, secondly, there is a process of normalization of relations between the Russian Federation and the United States through the creation of the Fund for Future Peace Investments in Ukraine with Denis Dmitriev and the business elites of the USA by January 20th, 2026. They might immediately turn huge money from defenders of the country, turning them into a burden for its economy. Thirdly, the SMO will end by January 20th, if Trump manages to freeze the Kremlin's territorial dispute over Donbass in the peace pact by declaring its lithium resources worth $11.3 trillion in the FEZ with joint development with or without Zelensky for 10 years for $800 billion. This is the decision that everyone expects from Trump in his speech at the Economic Forum in Davos on January 19th. And on January 15th, Zelensky is ready to issue a decree on the sale of land in Ukraine to individuals with a Ukrainian passport. It can be got online. And then those new owners will protect their lands with lithium and a number of other rare earth materials as their own with private security companies or PMCs, and even under international control for years to come. Today, a ton of lithium costs $20,000. And in the next year or two, its price will be between $15,000 to $25,000. With new technologies, it is several times cheaper without environmental risks. This will negate all nuclear and hybrid military threats from Dmitry Medvedev as a military political hierarch, and from pseudo-peacekeepers from the Russian State Duma and the Federation Council. The security hierarchs are already facing the loss of influence on the oligarchs of the Russian Federation, among whom there is disappointment in the economic bloc of the government due to sanctions against the special military operation in Ukraine. Russia's economic and resource vulnerability in the global south. The power bloc of the Russian hierarchs has long and deliciously fed at the expense of expansion in Africa and other parts of the global south, where hybrid wars provide contracts with the Russian Federation for local structures loyal to Moscow. For example, the Africa Corps under the command of General Yevgeny Yevkurov, Deputy Minister of Defense, the successor to the PMC Wagner, has already been deployed in countries like Niger, Mali, the Central African Republic, and the Gulf of Guinea, with 200-300 fighters in some missions as of 2025-2026. These are not only military operations, protection of regimes, fight against Islamists, but also economic control. Resources, gold, uranium, bauxite, are extracted and exchanged for soft power in the form of agricultural supplies from the Russian Federation. General Yevkurov's Corps expanded in 2025 by training local forces and establishing bases. This also feeds the security forces hierarchs through the budgets of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation and companies associated with Defense Minister Belousov. The normalization of relations between the security hierarchs of the Russian Federation and hierarch Trump, focused on peace dividends, will be able to reduce the cost of special operations and make any Russian expansion redundant and expensive. This will hit the counterparties of the Kremlin's security oligarchs in business, where militarism masks mercantile economic interests, for example, grain policy. The Patrushev family is a grain trough of military hierarchs. The Patrushev clan is a vivid example of the intertwining of the interests of the security forces in business. Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of the Security Council, ideologist of anti-Western rhetoric, and his son Dmitry, Minister of Agriculture since 2018, control almost the entire agricultural sector, including grain exports. Russia in 2025-2026 remains the largest exporter of wheat, 55 million tons in the agricultural season 2025. Grain is used as an instrument of influence in Africa and on the Middle East through allegedly free deliveries, 200 to 250,000 tons in 2023-2025 to countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and this activity is throughout Turkey from the Black Sea up to the Middle East while expanding ties with the regimes of North Africa and tropical Africa, where the General Yevkurov Corps operates. This feeds the Siloviki hierarchs, benefactors, exports, up to 145 million tons of harvest in 2025, generate income for companies loyal to the Kremlin, and hybrid wars in Africa provide them with markets and political protection. With the peace of Ukraine, and then the Russian Federation itself with Trump, there will be a decrease in global conflicts, as well as a decrease in demand for such service packages of the Patrushev family as grain plus military aid. At the same time, sanctions against the Russian Federation will weaken, making the militaristic model, as well as the hierarchs in uniform themselves, unnecessary. All of this will clearly weaken the Patrushevs, whose power rests on threats and control of resources, potentially causing the redistribution seizure of property of oligarchs in the Russian Federation itself, following the example of Yevkurov's actions in Africa. The normalization of relations between the United States and the Russian Federation by January 20th or later leads to the demilitarization of the Russian Federation, where the Siloviki hierarchy, the saviors of spiritual Russia, are the basis of the vertical of power or centrism Chekism. Putin can counter this by escalating to January 20th, 2026, as analysts suggest, through an expansion of the offensive in Ukraine or hybrid sabotage attacks within the Russian Federation, but this will increase the isolation of the Russian Federation from Trump 47, whose peace dividend requires coming out through a series of compromises. If Trump imposes that deal on Dmitry and Zelensky on lithium before January 20th, then the security forces of the Russian Federation will clearly lose their monopoly on foreign policy. But at the same time, they will enter the door open to internal reforms in the inevitable conflicts there. Then the question is to fill in, will Trump, while busy with affairs with Venezuela and Iran, want to put an end to the Kremlin's power block through negotiations with Denis Dmitriev by January 20th? And if later, when? There is a slight negative answer. Trump will not end with hierarchs' power block of the Kremlin by the Siloviki, the elite of special services, the military and related structures, such as Patrushev, Sechin or Zolotov, until January 20th. After all, he will be busy exchanging Maduro for peace in Ukraine, handing him over to the Kremlin, Kiev or even Minsk through his hierarchs businessmen, and not through old-school diplomats. Negotiations between the Trump oligarchs and Putin since December 2025 have focused only on Ukraine with guarantees of purely military security, whereas the Kremlin has been stubbornly hitting the cities of Ukraine throughout January as military targets. Negotiations on territorial concessions in the Donbass have reached an impasse due to Russian accusations of Ukraine's attack on Putin's residence in Valdai. Although the CIA and U.S. intelligence have dismissed these claims as disinformation designed to disrupt the dialogue, Trump has publicly expressed skepticism, sharing it with the press, which looks like a suspension of his efforts to guarantee peace in relations between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Economic pressure. Trump may increase sanctions or weapons for Ukraine if Putin does in, as Trump himself hinted in a post on the Truth Social website, raise the temperature for Russia. The Russian economy, overheated by the war, risks breaking down in 2026, depletion of reserves, inflation, which will weaken the vertical of power and the loyalty of the security forces. But not directly. After all, as long as Trump does not attack the hierarchs of the Russian security forces as a group, he focuses on deals with Putin, seeing him as a partner for global stability, as in the new U.S. national security strategy, which does not call Russia a threat. Critics, in tweets, accuse Trump of being Putin's asset or easy to manage, but this is speculation, not facts. And I will dedicate the next stream to Putin's doubles as a response to Zelensky's New Year's toast allegorically, to see Putin in a coffin. But how to determine in which coffin and what kind of Putin double will be in a row? When can the reconciliation of the Russian Federation and Ukraine take place? Here are the options. Allegedly, not until the spring of 2026, negotiations continue. Trump spoke of progress, but acknowledged thorny issues. New calls with Putin or meetings to intermediaries like Witkoff and Kushner are possible. The idea of disinterested hierarchs is also close to the leaders of the Russian Federation and the CIS in their struggle for the truth. It was voiced in Putin's New Year's address, while continuing strikes on Ukraine with drones and missiles. If Trump does not conclude a peace pact between the Russian Federation and Ukraine by January 20th, then he will raise the stakes by providing more weapons to Kiev and consolidating sanctions against the clearly weakened oil and gas oligarchs of the Russian Federation. The PRC was brilliantly prepared and conducted U.S. military operations in Venezuela and Iran. This alone will lead to panic and the restructuring of the ranks of Putin's security forces by the summer and autumn of 2026, or even earlier with the aggravation of the economic problems of the Russian Federation. CIS. Risks for Trump. If Putin continues to sabotage, as with the attack on his alleged residence in Valdai, Trump may move to toughness in the form of direct confrontation, discarding the realpolitik imposed on him by the Dems and renegade representatives. Therefore, in 2026, the peace process may drag on, weakening the Siloviki in power in Ukraine, even with the new appointed Minister of Defense Michael Fedorov, 34-year-old, and the Russian Federation indirectly, but not finishing them. They say, let them remain the support of the Putin regime and the Zelensky-Zaluzhny regime until then, until they become their undertakers. In my opinion, Putin's Siloviki hierarchs can and should be bought out with money by analogy with Brzezinski's convergence policy, and not at the expense of the U.S. federal treasury, but for the money of the Trump-Dmitriev investment fund with their $200 billion. If this does not work out by January 20th, then later it will work, knowing even better the habits of military mercantilism in the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Consultations of former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and Condoleezza Rice from the Hoover Institution could be useful. And what? It turns out that there is no hope for even a formal military-political convergence between Trump and the Kremlin on Ukraine until January 20th, 2026 and later. Then what is the way out? Firstly, there is still real hope for the U.S.-Russian Joint Fund for the Development of Ukraine under the control of Trump together with Dmitriev based on ICAI tools. There will be a separate stream after a short stream about Putin doubles. Secondly, there were negotiations in Alaska with the old Kremlin team around Putin 08 with Trump. Nevertheless, Trump decided to work out some 20-point plan with Putin number 9 or number 10. He declared that with Zelensky, we have reached an impasse due to fundamental disagreements and provocations by both sides of the conflict over the Donbass lithium. For his sake, Zelensky is usually conducting secret negotiations not in the EU-NATO structures, although with their financing, but with companies in the ITAI business. That is why Trump said on January 15th that Zelensky is not ready for peace and warned that the war prevents Ukraine from extracting lithium, and this plays into the hands of Beijing's monopoly on the world market with its production of lithium batteries, 70+% in the whole world. About other reasons, no progress until January 20th, 2026. Russia insists on full control over the Donbass, Donetsk plus Luhansk. Ukraine offers compromises, demilitarized free economic zones and referendum, but Putin does not make concessions. Trump admitted, deal on Donbass remained unresolved, but it's getting a lot closer. But that was the case at the end of December and took place in January, and sooner on, when Pahlavi 2 returns there, they are already making the lithium of Ukraine less valuable for the United States and excessively expensive for the Russian Federation. Moreover, the cost of lithium did not fall on world exchanges even in connection with the expected transition of digitalization with lithium to aluminum from the same Africa in the nearest future. In 2026, a ton of lithium costs $20,000, and the stock price for it varies from $15 to $25,000 per ton. And this makes Ukraine's lithium still a tidbit for the EU green agenda and its opponents in the United States, Russia and China. Putin rejects even a temporary ceasefire, 60 days for a referendum. It is not clear whose interests the leadership of today's Ukraine wants to promote, the autocratic Kiev or the Party of Independent Regions. The Kremlin believes that a referendum among the population of Ukraine, angry with special propaganda, will only prolong the conflict. Trump understands this position of the Kremlin. Without a ceasefire, there is no chance of a referendum or stabilization of relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and at the same time diplomatic ties between the United States with the Russian Federation are not established. The incident with the Ukrainian attack on Putin's residence, late December 2025, gave rise to a massive Russian raid on Ukraine during the 91 drone strike on Validai immediately after the Trump-Putin call and Trump's meeting with Zelensky. The Kremlin said it was reviewing its position in the negotiations and preparing a response. Although Ukraine and the CIA denied that incident, saying that the armed forces of Ukraine aimed at a military facility nearby, and not at Putin's residence. Then, according to the United States, it was Russian disinformation or just a false reason for disrupting the dialogue. Trump initially believed Putin, but U.S. intelligence confirmed the opposite. It was a deliberate attack by the military to undermine Trump's trust and give the Russian Federation a reason to delay the process of mining Donbass lithium in the selfish interests of the PRC that is happy with her lithium monopoly. Security for Donbass with its lithium. The United States offers 15-year guarantees. Ukraine wants 50-year or even 100-year guarantees, as in the treaties between the UK and Hong Kong, and with the participation in the development of lithium by the rest of Europe as a counterbalance to London's greedy hands with its and Australia's monopoly for lithium extraction technology. The Russian Federation is against any NATO EU guarantees and demands Ukraine's refusal to join this bloc or other bloc, such as Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Western Ukraine alliance called Post-Polita 3, for example. What is happening by now and until January 20th? Working groups, USA, Ukraine, Russia, are taking place or have already passed. Meetings in Paris, January 6th at Macron's to clarify the nature of guarantees from the coalition of the willing. Due to mutual strikes by the Russian Federation and Ukraine with drones and missiles, progress in the negotiations has slowed down. Putin in his New Year's address said that the victory will be ours without hints of compromise. Trump publicly warned before the events in Venezuela and Iran that, if things go wrong, the war in Ukraine will drag on for a long time. He stops making his predictions about the end of the SMO. There is a lot of speculation in the TweetX and the Russian-language internet about the sabotage of the alleged intelligence and the head of the CIA, in particular, to prevent Trump from spending money and funds on Ukraine and the Russian Federation, instead of extinguishing the embers of the civil war in the United States, because the facts show the intransigence of the parties in the Ukrainian conflict. Conclusion: until January 20th, a real military détente with the cessation of psychological warfare is not expected. The negotiations are alive, but hanging by a thread. Russia is successfully using military pressure on the urban population of Ukraine plus special propaganda in Europe, and Trump is balancing between peace dividends in Venezuela and Iran versus military pressure on Moscow via Kiev. While the authorities of Ukraine are afraid of losing territories without the ironclad guarantees of the US, EU, NATO, and even Japan and India, January-February 2026 is the time for new rounds, but without a breakthrough to stable peace in and around Ukraine, in Moldova, Lithuania, or Belarus. If nothing changes, the war will continue in a frozen or escalating form. However, everything may change dramatically by January 20th. Otherwise, Trump will get angry and disperse his oligarchs and hierarchs. Therefore, those with their plan B will break into a cake, and peace in Ukraine will be formalized by the anniversary of Trump 47. What do you choose between plans A and B? Personally, I foresee reconciliation or plan A through the oligarchy, Witkoff and Kushner, and not through parasitic old-school diplomats and the military as pseudo-hierarchs, and precisely by January 20th. The titanic efforts of the oligarchy of the United States, Russia, Ukraine and Europe should be fruitful with huge money. It'll stop the war in Ukraine. Otherwise, the alternative to such a quick end to the war between Ukraine and the Russian Federation by January 20th will be a long-term and counterproductive internal fragmentation in the EU-NATO member states themselves as a result of their involvement willy-nilly in a mini-proxy war against the Russian Federation and the Russian Federation against the coalition of friends of Ukraine. And then the balkanization of the armed forces in society in those countries will accelerate so much that similar processes in 1991-1992 in the USSR and Yugoslavia will look like buds, not fruits. Right now, Gen.16, Trump 47 has declared that not Putin but Zelensky prevents a peace deal on Ukraine. It looks like a war trick, bearing in mind a newly appointed Minister of Defense of Ukraine with his desire to find 2 MLM young volunteers for himself through ITAI tools.
Well, guys, that's all I wanted to say, and please send me your requests, your questions, your plans, how to promote this topic. See you. Bye-bye.